part of this first unit in the course, I have prepared a couple of presentations that include preliminary ideas about translation that might be useful for an approach to the study of translation from a theoretical standpoint, and I have entitled them Prolegomena to the study of translation. Some of these ideas also apply to oral interpreting, but we will focus on translation or written translation as such. The first block in this Prolegomena is focuses on defining translation. The learning outcomes from this first part of the Unit 1 would be the following. Hopefully students will be able, at the end of this unit, will be able to explain why translation can be usefully approached as what we can call the 3 Ps: product, process, and profession. They will be able to identify key features of translation and exemplify or illustrate these key features of translation. They'll be able to name and describe the key textual features or functions which will be useful basic building blocks upon which they can establish begin to establish their textual expertise as translators. Finally, they'll be able to contextualize a selection of translation definitions by different authors and different scholars in the various theoretical approaches or general translation approaches or theoretical approaches to translation. So they can label, tag, classify these selected translation definitions. Short index, we will discuss what is translation from those 3 Ps: profession, product, and process. Then we'll move on to approach translation from single out from a classification of different features or basic features of translation. We'll look at communication as a key factor in understanding what translation is. We'll look at meaning and the importance of context. We'll look at cultural factors and the reception factor or element in translation. We'll basically look at text genre. We'll look at aim and nature of translation or the translation process in very basic terms. And then we'll look at different definitions of translation, selected definitions of translation versus the intersemiotic, interlinguistic, and interlinguistic translation definition by Jacobson in 1959. Then we will move on to look at translation as a linguistic activity by the Canadian linguistics, applied linguists Vinay and Abernett in 1958. Then we'll look at translation as communication, translation as a textual operation, and translation as a purposeful activity, which will tie in nicely with the functional approach that permeates the whole of this course and becomes the backbone, the theoretical backbone of my translation philosophy and translation training. So in this case, it will be an individual activity. I would like you to pause the video for a second and spend maybe a minute trying to come down with 2 or 3 keywords. If you were asked to define what translation is and distill what translation is to just 2 or 3 keywords, which ones would you write? Think carefully, because they have to encapsulate what you think translation is, and they could be the basis for a definition of translation. So stop the video now and write down 2 or 3 words. Maybe you've come up with words like languages, communication, or maybe you thought of, well, translation is about conveying a message, it's about meaning. Or maybe loyalty. You thought that translation has to do with someone being loyal, faithful to a message or an individual, maybe the source text author, whoever wrote that novel. I need to be loyal to him or her as the author. Or maybe you thought of equivalence. Translation is about achieving equivalent messages, equivalent meanings, or equivalent functions, or equivalent purposes. Who knows? But you come up with something at the end of the translation process that somehow has equal value, or is recognized as an equivalent of a source text or a source material. Maybe you thought of free or literal, the eternal, traditional, dichotomic terms. On the one hand, we can translate freely, or we can translate literally. Or maybe you thought of culture. Translation is about cultures. Cultures in contact, or translators are bridges, human bridges between cultures. they promote understanding and communication. Or maybe you thought of style. How difficult is it to convey the voice of the author in translating a text, let alone the form, the style of that text, or should it even be conveyed? So maybe you came up with all the words that are equally valid as building blocks of a translation definition. If we look at translation from the point of view of just defining what translation is, we'll find that it's not as easy as we may have thought. We all have intuitive ideas about translation because we use language, and in your case, you're a bilingual or even trilingual, and you've already been doing some translation thus far. So, but if you have to sit down and write a definition of translation, it's not as easy as we think. So if we look at the dictionary, the shorter of Oxford English Dictionary, we find some interesting things about, under translation. The removal or conveyance from one person, place, time, or condition to another. Interesting. Transfer, transferal, removal of a bishop even from one see to another. So we see that one of the meanings of translation, one of the strands of meaning, has to do with movement, the conveyance from point A to point B. Second, we look at the actual proper definition that might be more applicable to what we're doing here. The action or process of expressing the sense of a word, passage, etc. in a different language. Also the product of this, a version in a different language. So as we can see, the dictionary definition of translation focuses on the action or the process of reformulating the sense of a word or a passage from one language, from language A to language B. And it also focuses on the product, the textual product of this process. So we can count translations. That's one translation, that's two translations. So we have another interesting, a couple of interesting insights: process, product, meaning, etc. So if we continue from the dictionary, we can echo what Shuttleworth and Cowie said in 1997 in their useful key terms of their book on the key terminology in translation studies, the academic discipline that focuses on the study of translation phenomena. When they said, translation is an incredibly broad notion which can be understood in many different ways. For example, one may talk of translation as a process or a product, identifies subtypes as literary translation, technical translation, subtitle, and machine translation. Moreover, while more typically it just refers to the transfer of written texts, the term sometimes also includes interpreting. So as we can see the process, the product. We can look at different ways of classifying translation according to different aspects like topic, technology involved, medium, etc. We will look at definitions as classifications of translation in the B block of Unit 1. But suffice it to say, and we made the point across, that we have a complex problem in our hands when we have to come up with a definition of translation. And many of these such definitions have been put forward. Obviously, we'll look at some of them at the end of the unit. But it is useful to try to simplify using the 3 P's. On the one hand, we've just seen that translation can be understood as a process, something you do, something you carry out with different stages, and with a result. And then we can also look at the result of that process, the second P, product. And finally, we can look at translation from a professional, industrial point of view, as a profession, something that certain people do and get paid for in exchange for some expertise. So if we were to start also looking at building the foundations for our understanding of translation, we can follow Amparo Hurtado Albir in her introduction to translation studies or traductología, and she identifies, and I think is useful as basic concepts that we can build upon, 4 premises about translation, 4 basic ideas about translation that we can use as points of departure. First of all, translation exists because there's an obvious language difference. You can see Bruegel the Old is one of his famous paintings depicting the Tower of Babel, or Babel, as it is pronounced in English. The story of Babel and the confusion of languages presented, depicted as a curse, is actually, for translators, is a blessing, because translation wouldn't exist without language difference. We need to navigate the language difference, and therefore we need translators, because we would never be able to learn every single language on earth. So we want to access certain messages in language that are unknown to us. We need to rely on translators and translation. Second basic premise about translation is the key aim of translation is communication. So translation exists because of language difference, and one of the key overarching aims of translation is to achieve communication. Number 3, translations have recipients, and these recipients, those who are going to be using, are end users of our translations that we are going to produce. They need them because they lack knowledge of the language and the culture of the source text. So we don't translate in a vacuum, and this is important to remember. We translate for someone. We translate for, normally, especially in a commercial environment, in a professional environment, we translate for a user, for a reader. And it's always useful to always remember this third premise, that we translate for somebody, for someone. And finally, that translations, the way translations read, the way translations look like, the way the different ways in which translation reflects the translator's decision making in that translation process is determined by a purpose. And translations should have a purpose, and we may have different purposes. And this is also important to remember, because it reflects the functional approach to translation that, again, is a leitmotif in my approach to translation. So after looking at the first 4 premises about translation, it is useful to continue looking at translation from the point of view of 3 main features of translation. So we talked about the 3 P's. Translation is a process, a product, and a profession. We looked at the 4 premises about translation, and then we're going to add more food for thought with 3 features of translation also identified by Dr. Amparo Hurtado in her manual. So these 3 features of translation have to do with the main dimensions of translation phenomena and the translation process. Communication, we've already discussed that. Translation is a communication act. It's communicative in nature. We translate for the purposes of communication. There's a message issued by a sender to certain recipients in a source language, in a language 1, a language of departure, and in a certain contextual, cultural context, so to speak. The translator is tasked with taking that message, which had original recipients and an original sender, and make that message understandable, relatable to a new group, a new set of recipients, of readers, listeners, who are located in a different cultural environment, in a different setting, and who lack knowledge of the language and even pragmatic background knowledge that was enjoyed by the source text sender, the author of the text, and the target readers. So the translator needs to make the decisions that are necessary in order to enable communication, understanding of this new message, or this message that has been created on the basis of another message for a new set of readers in a new language. The second of these basic features of translation has to do with texts. Translation is a textual operation. What do we mean by that? We mean that translation does not belong, if we look at it from a linguistic standpoint, especially structural linguistics, the school of thought that looks at language as a complex system with different levels. If we look at translation from the point of view of language, we will come to the conclusion that translation does not actually happen at the language level as such. It doesn't happen at the level of the language as a system. We're not translating the whole of the English language into the whole of the Spanish language when we undertake a translation project from English into Spanish. What we are doing is translating contextualized offers of information, not isolated units without context. We translate texts. And these texts, whether oral or written, are instances of use of certain selected elements from a system, a linguistic system, say English, that an individual has selected from that repertoire of resources, linguistic in the sense of vocabulary, grammatical structures and so on, and these are used, combined, to convey a certain message in a certain context with certain aims. So translators deal with texts, not so much with languages as systems, but we deal with texts. That's the raw material we work with as translators. So what does this mean? This means that it has a few interesting implications from the point of view of translation theory and practice. But one of them is that we as translators need to become textual experts. We need to know how texts work and how a certain text is put together. And we need to master the techniques of texture, how texts stand together as units, and the terminology varies, but we need to know about, for instance, cohesion, what links exist between the syntactic structures, grammatical structures of a text, and the meaning in that text, or coherence, how texts are organized so that they are perceived as intelligible, readable units. And we need to know about textual genres. We need to know what makes a contract, or what features make a poem, etc. So we deal with texts, not with overall languages when we translate. And finally, obviously, we are knowing more and more about this third feature of translation with the use of neuroimaging and the advances made not only in technology but also in neuroscience. Translation is a complex cognitive activity. Just to quote Amparo Hurtado again, translation is an activity carried out by a subject, the translator, who needs a specialized competence. We can call it translation competence, as we have already explained earlier, and who must undertake a complex mental process in order to translate. Stages of that process, the basic stages will be, or steps will be, comprehending or understanding the meaning of the source text and then being able to reformulate this meaning in a new or target language.